So thank you for the invitation to come and speak to you tonight about a topic that is a little bit unusual for a lawyer to be thinking about and talking about, which is the lessons that we can learn from science fiction when we're looking to the future of, what does it look like when we have sustained human presence in space and we have corporate actors really dominating those activities? And does the existing law that we have provide enough protection for humans who are going to be living in space? Before I begin, I'll acknowledge that I'm speaking to you tonight from Ghana land, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So science fiction, as we all know, has long explored what the future of sustained human presence in space might look like. And we have some utopian futures where humans are thriving, and we also have contrasting dystopian futures where it's a nightmarish struggle for survival. So science fiction is presenting us with glimpses of what the future might look like. The future is turning into reality, though, because we do have a lot now of space missions planning to have habitation on other planets, including the Moon, Mars, and elsewhere. NASA itself has a long history of planned crewed missions to the Moon, Mars, and beyond, including what they call colonization studies. I don't like the term colonization when we're talking about human habitation of space for a variety of reasons. Colonization on Earth obviously carries with it some really horrific activities. We don't want to be replicating that in space. So I prefer to talk about habitation of space rather than colonization, although that term is certainly still used, particularly by SpaceX. The current Artemis program includes plans for a base camp, which will be inhabited, as well as Gateway, which will also be an inhabited space station. And in 2004, then President Bush proclaimed in his vision for space exploration that crewed missions to Mars were an important part of the United States' objective to extend human presence across the solar system. The NASA Transition Authorization Act of 2017 explicitly mentioned the requirements of future exploration and utilization activities leading to human habitation on the surface of Mars, and the long-term goal of human missions near or on the surface of Mars in the 2030s. I don't think they're going to hit those deadlines, but they are certainly still activities that they are actively working towards. We then also have the China National Space Administration and Roscosmos, together with a growing number of partners, having plans for the International Lunar Research Station, which is again intended to be an inhabited space station on the Moon. That's intended to be operational by the 2030s. Again, I'm not sure they're going to hit their deadline, but they're still certainly working towards it, and the growing number of partners are actually signing up to join that mission. In 2017, the United Arab Emirates unveiled its Mars 2117 project, which planned to establish the first inhabitable human settlement on Mars by 2117. So their timing is probably a little bit more realistic in terms of when we're going to have sustained human presence on Mars, but there's lots of activities happening. We've also got private space companies who are planning to establish human habitats beyond Earth, including on other planets and in orbits. In 2016, as I'm sure you all know, Elon Musk announced SpaceX's interplanetary transport system as part of the ultimate goal of making humans a multiplanetary species. SpaceX envisages about 1,000 spacecraft leaving Earth every 26 months, enabling a permanent human presence on Mars of 1 million people within, they estimate, 40 to 100 years. And in January of 2020, Elon Musk tweeted that he expects 100,000 people to regularly travel between Earth and Mars at an expected cost of between $100,000 and US $500,000, with loans available for those who can't afford the ticket cost up front. The cost of the flight would be repaid by working in the SpaceX Mars City, an initiative which has been criticised as introducing indentured servitude on Mars. Indentured servitude on Earth is bad enough, but when you're dependent on someone for the very air that you breathe, the potential for grave abuses and suffering increases dramatically. We also then have Blue Origin's vision for what human habitation of Mars might look like. And Jeff Bezos's plans are to develop what are being called space colonies. Again, that term colony, which I really don't like. These are intended to be human habitats in orbit that replicate Earth's weather and gravitational pull, holding as many as 1 million people, and somewhat aspirationally, including rivers and forests and wildlife. And I love the visual representation of a deer there, really transporting what Earth is up into space. But again, these habitats are going to be run like corporate towns. So the citizens, the inhabitants of these environments are going to be subject to the laws and regulations that are imposed by the corporate operator. While this does provide some scope for creating new opportunities and potentially improved ways of living, it also reduces citizenship from a social contract to a commercial one. And that contract might be one-sided and practically difficult to enforce in a domain where there is no sovereign with oversight over what is happening within that corporate town. So what lessons can we learn from science fiction and the imagined future for humans living in these future space habitats? So I'm going to talk to you about a couple of texts that are favourites of mine. And these are texts that I'm relying on quite a lot in some work that I'm doing at the moment, where I'm really looking to find the law replicated within these texts and see what lessons we can learn about, what other laws we might need to stop the dystopian futures that we see portrayed in these texts. So the common theme in the dystopian future that we have in Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy and James S.A. Corey's The Expanse series of books is the role of the corporate actor and the impact that corporate conduct has on humans living beyond Earth. Whether it's by deliberate action or unintended consequence in pursuit of profit, it's clear from these texts that corporate actors are imagined to significantly impact the futures and experiences of humans living on other planets. The question that I'm exploring in this body of work is whether existing international space law can help to protect those inhabitants of future space settlements from the nightmarish future that we see portrayed in these texts. So for anyone not familiar with these specific texts, I'll just briefly provide you with some context to then allow us to examine what the law has to say about that and what lessons the law can learn. So the Mars trilogy explores the terraforming and habitation of Mars by the first 100 human settlers and their descendants. The first novel in the trilogy, Red Mars, begins with the first 100 hoping to establish a small scientific research station. However, the real motives of those responsible for sending the mission to Mars are soon revealed. The mission to settle Mars is driven by mega corporations on Earth, referred to as transnats, and their desire to terraform Mars and exploit the rich mineral deposits of Mars for profit. The scientific motives are secondary to the corporate lust for profits. Debates between the members of the first 100 about whether Mars should be rapidly terraformed or preserved in a pristine state eventually lead to an ideological split between the members of the first 100, between the Greens in favour of terraforming and the Reds in favour of preserving Mars in its original state. But the scientific interests of the first 100 and this ideological split are soon displaced by the hyper-capitalist motives of the transnats, the enormous corporations who exert influence on the fictional United Nations Office for Martian Affairs and then push for exploitation of resources on Mars with no consideration of the risk that may pose to inhabitants of the Red Planet. Eventually, in the story, the transnats replace entire governments on Earth, and the economic motives behind the terraforming and exploitation of Mars are more starkly revealed in the text. While frequently characterised as being the best way for humanity to acquire fuel, drinkable water, and breathable air as humans venture further into the solar system, the Mars trilogy warns us that the corporate desire to acquire profits can lead to incredible destruction, violence, suffering, and conflict. A revolution is eventually launched against the occupying corporations, which is quickly crushed by the willingness of the Earth-aligned Transnat troops to use extreme violence to annihilate any opposition. The vulnerability of life on a planet without a habitable atmosphere is highlighted when biospheres are ripped open and destroyed, and inhabitants are left to find refuge or perish. Even the hero first Martian, John Boone, perishes due to oxygen deprivation, having been beaten and left unconscious beyond the safety of a human habitat. The Mars trilogy's predictions about the power of corporations and the risks posed to humans by corporate actions delivers an even starker warning now than it did in the 1990s when the novels were written. With the increasing technological dominance of corporate actors in space and the planned human settlement of space by private companies, the potential risks to future inhabitants of corporate space settlements are greater than ever. As the Mars trilogy warns us, the corporate desire for profit frequently comes at the expense of the weak and vulnerable. Similarly, in the Expanse series, corporate actors play a crucial role in shaping the politics, economy, and social dynamics of the universe in which the series is set. Earth and Mars corporations control the vast majority of commercialized resources, including water, air, food, and minerals, whereas Belter corporations control the trade routes. The vulnerability of humans in space is highlighted early in the first novel, Leviathan Wakes, which opens with the ice hauler, the Canterbury, responding to a distress signal from a mysterious stricken vessel after some debate amongst the crew about the obligation to render assistance. The novel also explores the applicability of law in this context, specifically the obligations to rescue astronauts in distress. And you'll see the quote on the slide there from page 14, so very early in the text. The law of the solar system was unequivocal. In an environment as hostile to life as space, the aid and goodwill of your fellow humans wasn't optional. The emergency signal, just by existing, obligated the nearest ship to stop and render aid, which didn't mean the law was universally followed. The extreme vulnerability of humans in space is a repeated theme in the novels, with a reliance on others for every aspect of survival, even air to breathe, impacting the social dynamics of space habitats. Against this backdrop, the impact of corporate actors on the lives of those living in space habitats is explored. Corporations such as Protogen are portrayed as prioritising profits over human lives and the well-being of inhabitants, even conducting unethical experiments on inhabitants of space stations in their attempts to control and weaponise the mysterious alien biological substance known as the protomolecule. Protogen even goes to the extent of instigating a war between Earth and Mars to benefit shareholder interests, maximise profit, and seek corporate advantage. The corporate actors in the Expanse series are portrayed as sinister and largely uncontrollable, with the ability to manipulate governments, highlighting the potential risks of allowing unchecked corporate power to exist in space. So can existing international space law provide any protection against the excesses of such actors? International space law never contemplated sustained human habitation beyond the Earth. The existing international space law regime was created at a time when very few countries had spacefaring capabilities, let alone any private or commercial actors. Negotiated at the height of the Cold War, the first of the space treaties is essentially an arms control treaty intended to prevent the spread of conflict on Earth into space. There are 5 international space law treaties. We have the Outer Space Treaty, the Rescue and Return Agreement, the Liability Convention, the Registration Convention, and the Moon Agreement, as well as numerous soft law instruments. The Moon Agreement is the least significant of the space law treaties and sometimes considered to be a failed treaty due to its low level of ratifications. None of the major spacefaring countries are a party to the Moon Agreement, and it currently has 18 state parties, soon to be 17 with the withdrawal of Saudi Arabia, which will take effect in early January. Australia is a party to the Moon Agreement, and so it is bound by its additional obligations, which becomes particularly relevant if we're talking about space resource extraction and utilisation, or space mining. Space law has been described by Professor Frans van der Donk as being all law that actually, one way or another, follows humans into outer space. The applicability of international law, including the Charter of the United Nations, was recognised as a guiding principle by the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, even before negotiations for the Outer Space Treaty had commenced. Article 3 of the Outer Space Treaty explicitly confirms that international law generally applies to space as a domain. This means that international space law includes not just the 5 specific space law treaties, or for most countries it's the 4, for Australia it's the 5, but it also includes international law more generally, including treaties and customary international law, and general principles of law. This broad understanding of what law applies in space may provide a pathway to regulating the excesses of corporate actors in space and protecting inhabitants of future space settlements beyond the Earth. The Outer Space Treaty provides the legal foundation for all activities in outer space. All current spacefaring countries are a party to the Outer Space Treaty, and several of its articles are considered to be customary international law. That means it applies regardless of whether the country has ratified the treaty or not. It applies to all countries. Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty allows states parties to use outer space, which at first glance would include the use by humans of other planets as a place to live, provided the habitat was operated for the benefit and interests of all countries. However, the Outer Space Treaty also provides that outer space should be the province of all humankind, and that outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, is not subject to national appropriation by claim of sovereignty, by means of use or occupation, or by any other means. This is known as the principle of non-appropriation, and it's contained in Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty. This is arguably a principle of customary international law, having received widespread acceptance and representing state practice for more than 50 years. As customary international law, the principle of non-appropriation applies to all. This means that no one, be they state, corporate actor, or individual, can exercise legal control over any part of outer space, including celestial bodies, as if it were their legal territory. The operation of Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty means that every space activity is ultimately a national space activity for which a country may be held responsible. This means that states are required to ensure that corporations are prevented from appropriation of celestial bodies and exercising exclusive control over any part of outer space. However, as the Mars trilogy and the Expanse series both warn, megacorporations may grow so large and powerful that they can exert influence over governments, which would reduce the protection offered by the anticipated state oversight of corporate space activities provided by existing licensing regimes. For example, in Red Mars, Frank Chalmers is prepared to renegotiate the fictional Mars Treaty, described as having been based on the old Outer Space Treaty, noting that this was the first mistake because the Outer Space Treaty was in fact a very fragile arrangement, and so the Mars Treaty is too. Further, the absence of sovereignty leaves open both the possibility of de facto control over a celestial body being exercised by the first claimant, and the difficulty of any state being able to exercise actual control over such claims, whether they're legitimate or not. The potential for corporate behaviour in space to pose a real risk to both humans and the space environment is something that requires consideration now as we're on the verge of both human and robotic missions to space becoming more feasible. For example, Musk's vision for the SpaceX Mars city involves a servant class, easily controlled by restricting access to air, water, and food, while they repay an amount that the company decides will satisfy their debt. In the absence of any oversight mechanisms, there's a greater risk that humans in space habitats may fall victim to corporate exploitation. While it might seem a little far-fetched now, alarm bells should be ringing in relation to the potential erosion for norms which have only recently been established on Earth. We don't wish those norms to be eroded in space, such as the laws against slavery. As the Mars trilogy makes especially stark, this potential ambiguity regarding the practical ability to exercise jurisdiction through enforcement, laws, courts, and so on, also creates significant risks for the preservation of the planetary environment. Article 5 of the Outer Space Treaty provides that state parties must regard astronauts as envoys of humankind and render them all possible assistance in the event of accident, distress, or emergency landing. Article 5 goes on to provide that in carrying out activities in outer space and on celestial bodies, the astronauts of one state party shall render all possible assistance to the astronauts of other state parties. This is further expanded in the Rescue and Return Agreement, which extends the obligation to rescue and provide assistance to personnel of a spacecraft. The Moon Agreement takes the rescue obligation even further, with Article 10 of that treaty providing that state parties shall adopt all practicable measures to safeguard the life and health of persons on the Moon. For this purpose, they regard any person on the Moon as an astronaut within the meaning of the Outer Space Treaty, and also as part of the personnel of a spacecraft within the meaning of the Rescue and Return Agreement. It is this obligation to rescue that is being debated in the initial stages of Leviathan wakes, when discussing whether or not the spacecraft Canterbury must respond to the distress call, or whether the crew could simply ignore it and continue on their way. None of the space law treaties define astronaut or personnel of a spacecraft, and it remains unsettled at law whether all inhabitants of space habitats would be considered to be astronauts or personnel of a spacecraft, and thus be entitled to the protection. For example, would tourists to a private space station be entitled to assistance and to be rescued under the obligation to assist in the Outer Space Treaty and the Rescue and Return Agreement? Or does their status as tourist mean they fall outside the category of persons entitled to protection? What of children born in future space settlements? The terms astronauts and personnel of a spacecraft might suggest that individuals falling within those categories have had some specialised training or have an operational role in the mission. The principles regarding processes and criteria for selection, assignment, training, and certification of the ISS crew members for the International Space Station distinguishes between a professional astronaut or cosmonaut and a spaceflight participant, which does suggest that the interpretation of astronaut and personnel of a spacecraft requires something more than simple presence in space. One implication of this interpretation for humans living permanently off Earth is that there may be no obligation on others to rescue them or render assistance in the event of an emergency, such as shortage of oxygen, food, fuel, or water. However, as Leviathan Wakes reminds us, in an environment as hostile to life as space, the aid and goodwill of your fellow humans wasn't optional. The treatment of humans living in future space habitats is something that will also require further consideration before humans are living in such habitats, especially to the extent that they're controlled by corporate entities. In the Mars trilogy, we see heavy-handed tactics and extreme violence being used against inhabitants by Earth-aligned transnat troops in their efforts to quell dissent. Further, in the Expanse series, we see civilian spacecraft targeted and vaporized, and violent tactics by corporate mercenaries on Eros against civilians, as they were being herded into radiation shelters to be infected with the protomolecule. While international humanitarian law and international human rights law may assist in protecting humans in space habitats, and clearly both areas of law apply in space, the risk is still that corporate actors so far from Earth may not feel any need to temper their behaviour, and may consider that they are beyond the reach of any legal consequence. As we move towards a future as a multiplanetary species, international space law will need to strike a balance between encouraging the activities of corporations with positive and honourable motives and preventing malevolent corporate actors from exploiting and harming humans in space. The protective capacity of law must be utilised to ensure that humans living beyond Earth are adequately protected from suffering caused by corporate greed and do not suffer harm by deliberate action or as an unintended consequence of the pursuit of profits. While existing space law provides a good foundation for sustained human presence in space, it may not be sufficient to adequately protect humans living beyond Earth. Some obligations in respect of inhabited space stations may now be customary international law. For instance, the obligation to rescue an astronaut in distress. But further developments in the law are necessary to ensure clarity of responsibilities and obligations and to maximise protections for humans beyond Earth. In imagining the future for humans living in space, science fiction may help us to prevent a dystopian nightmare and offer us an opportunity to create a better future of sustained human presence in space. We must heed the warnings from science fiction about the risks that flow from allowing corporate greed to flourish unrestrained at the expense of those who live among the stars. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Okay, thanks very much, Stacey. Yeah, I think there's a couple of people made comments. I did something on For All Mankind, and Scott said something. You want to talk first, Scott? Or
I'm a science fiction fanatic, so I was really interested in your talk. So thanks very much for that, Stacey. I made a couple of comments in the chats. One of them was along the lines of, I mean, we've got the various space treaties which have been set up and administered by United Nations or other groups, groups of Earth-based countries. Once you get into space, you could argue that the United Nations really has no say in anything. Once you get into space, it's a group of countries that agree to do something. So if a corporation gets into space, as you suggested, things change. Laws only work while people agree to follow the laws. And corporates could well say that, hey, sorry guys, we're now on Mars. Anything you did on Earth doesn't relate to us. And as you said, set up your own laws. So I was typing some commentary along the lines of, maybe corporates really will rule the roost for a period of time until whatever happens, the citizens at some stage in the future wrest control from the corporation somehow as the power balance adjusts over time. And you actually talked about that a little bit after I wrote that comment. But I didn't know if you had any other comments you'd like to make on that. Corporates saying that we're independent of the United Nations, it doesn't apply, and that position stays until citizens get enough power by whatever means to create their own laws. And that's really what happened in the past in England when citizens got enough wealth and power to take the laws away from the king, basically.
So at the moment, the way that this is being I suppose, controlled, is that the Outer Space Treaty ultimately makes a country responsible for every space activity. Corporations are all registered somewhere. They are all carrying activities somewhere. They are all controlled by whatever the appropriate corporate laws are within that country. So in Australia, for example, an Australian space company will be incorporated generally under the Corporations Act, and that applies certain laws to their conduct. The Outer Space Treaty says that if that space company is engaging in a space activity, maybe they're launching from Australia, our licensing regime at the moment includes sort of a way of licensing corporate activities. But the Outer Space Treaty ultimately says if it's our corporation engaging in a corporate activity in space, Australia will still be responsible under Article 6, everything becomes a national activity, regardless of who's carrying it out. And we have an ongoing obligation of supervision. So we need to keep an eye on it. How long that continues for is yet to be tested. So if we're talking, as you've said in your comment, like long periods of time from now, we may see corporates going, well, we're not on Earth anymore. We don't care. And certainly that's what happens in The Expanse, and also a little in the Mars trilogy. They're so big that you can't have a single country keeping an eye on them. You can't have a licensing regime that provides any restraint or restrictions. They just do whatever they want. They make their own laws. International law is still going to try to get them. Whether it's actually capable of providing any restraint is another question, definitely.
Yeah. So if I was SpaceX and I was able to successfully set up a habitat on Mars, and personally I don't think that's possible for various reasons, but let's assuming it all works out, 5 years after I start setting up that habitat, I would set up a vote where the people are able to create their own government and incorporate a 100% owned subsidiary under the jurisdiction of that government on Mars, and then suddenly none of the space treaties apply to my 100% owned subsidiary.
Except that a lot of the Outer Space Treaty in particular is customary international law, so it applies to everybody. And we also have an additional problem of trying to have a right of self-determination where the criteria for self-determination aren't established. So under human rights law, a people can have a right of self-determination, but there are criteria that need to be established, including things like being geographically located separate to whoever the controlling power is, being ethnically and culturally distinct, all of those kinds of things, which wouldn't happen in the time frame of like 5 years. However, if we're talking generations down the line and we've got these habitats on other planets and we're having, third, fourth generation Martian or, whatever the people decide to call themselves, they've developed a new language, they're culturally have different practices now that are distinct from Earth, then we could certainly see the criteria for self-determination being established. I think that's where we're going to end up. I think we're going to end up with people going, am I coming back to Earth? If I'm not, then I don't really care about Earth law anymore. I'm going to make my own.
Yeah. Now, thanks very much for that. The second comments plural, because it's really two comments, related to the restriction of ownership of objects in space. And I thought, well, hold on a sec. There's a number of companies that are saying they're going to mine the asteroids. Hold on, you can't mine the asteroid unless you're going to claim some sort of ownership over it. So that seems to be a breach. And the second, the second one was, okay, we're not going to claim anything on the moon. That's going to remain for all of mankind until the first country says we're going to claim this 1,000 square miles of the moon as being ours. And once the first country does that, then the other countries are in a very difficult position.
So this is a big area of scholarship at the moment in international space law. So there's a couple of ways around this, and they all relate to interpretation of international law. So how do we interpret what the Outer Space Treaty says? There is this prohibition on appropriation. How do we get around that? Well, appropriation of the asteroid as a whole is prohibited under international space law, but appropriation of extracted component resources is not. So there's a distinction. Lawyers love having distinctions and technicalities on words, right? So there's a distinction that's being drawn between appropriation of an entire planet, for example, and appropriation of extracted components. So that's how we're getting around that.
I would really love to apply that on planet Earth and then go into somebody's house and take their lounge suite and say, hey, that's a loophole. I can do that.
Absolutely. So in relation to your other point, that this is a real problem where we're going to end up with potentially a first possessor claim on property rights in space. So the first one that gets there, that's it, you get everything, right? So that has the potential to obviously create huge conflict. You know, we don't want to have Star Wars in space, right? We don't want conflict to you know, roll over into the space domain. And the real risk is that if we are claiming parts of the moon or you know, parts of an asteroid or parts of Mars or wherever, that's what's going to happen, because you're going to try and push people out. So the Artemis Accords, I'm not sure if you've had the joy of reading the Artemis Accords. So the Artemis Accords are a series of, it's a political commitment, essentially. It's a document released by NASA, now has 32 space agencies who have signed up to it. It claims to be consistent with the international space law, so the Outer Space Treaty, not the Moon Agreement, because the US is not a party to the Moon Agreement. And the way that they are sort of dealing with the space mining issue is to introduce what they're calling a safety zone. Now, a safety zone is like an immediate area of operations, and it's like, you know, kind of keep out of this space at the moment because, you know, we're doing something that's really dangerous. You don't want to be in here because you might get hurt. That kind of idea. But it's always intended to be temporary. So how long temporary is, we don't know yet. This is all still being discussed and argued about. But that is a real stretch of what the existing international space law says. And this is national space agencies kind of pushing that boundary a little bit. You can imagine the corporate actors are pushing it even harder. So, yeah, this is definitely something space law is going to need to work out, you know, where are the boundaries going to be? Where are the guardrails that we're going to put in place? And we need to have more consistent, clear laws that apply to everybody. Yeah.
Yeah. And look, I'll just, I don't know whether it's a comment or a question. It's something I thought of at the start of your talk, and it's not to do with space law per se, but when you look at science fiction and some of the classics that I love, like Forbidden Planet and The Day the Earth Stood Still and all the rest of it. Okay, there were spaceships around and there were astronauts and all the rest of it. But the movies were really not about the technology. It was about the people and the psychologies of being in space and what the issues were on that level. You didn't address that in this speech of yours. Were there any comments maybe that you might want to make on those aspects of science fiction and what they're telling us about space?
Yeah, absolutely. I've got some colleagues who are working specifically on the psychological aspects of habitation in space and even aspects like, you know, the human robot interaction and what it's going to do to humans to be, you know, in a spacesuit for such a huge amount of time, to be isolated for such an amount of time, to be away from everything that it means to be human for sustained periods, all of those kinds of things. So that is completely out of my area of expertise, but they're doing amazing work. It's the Deep Space Habitation Group at the Andy Thomas Centre at the University of Adelaide. If you're interested in any of their work, they're doing amazing things. What I'm interested in is how we can, once we work out what those things are that are essential to humans thriving in a space environment, and that's where my psychology colleagues come in, to help us work out what those things are. Also, you know, architecture and exposure to green space and all of those kinds of things within a space habitat. Once we've worked those out, what are the rules that we need to make those things happen and to compel corporations, for example, to provide X amount of hours of rest break, to provide, you know, VR facilities so that you can, you know, look like you feel like you're at the beach or pretend that you have sunlight on you, you know, all of those kinds of things. So yeah, we're working on it.
Okay, I think I'll pass back to Wayne. I think I've said far too much.
Well, I think the other science fiction, if we're talking about that, I was just looking at season 4 of For All Mankind. It actually is covering similar The only thing is that the year's 2003, folks, which means that they've already got to Mars in 1994, and unfortunately we didn't do that here because it's an alternative universe. But the questions, some of those questions asked was they've got some of the corporations, I think Helios is the one that's particularly doing all the stuff at the moment. They've got some problems with financial side, and they're trying to work out how they can exploit asteroids now and make money because they've got money issues. So it's going to be touching on a lot of those types of things too. So it looks like there's going to be something else, the science fiction covering a lot of these things too. But the year's 2003, which is interesting. But then again, they already solved the global warming problem because they ended up developing fusion reactors, and because they mined helium-3 on the moon back in the 1980s and 90s. So some of those problems were solved in that series about 20 years prior to us, unfortunately for us. But I think it's going to be interesting to see how that one goes too, actually, because it's going to cover some similar types of topics. But actually looking at what Jeff Wheeler's made a comment about, the law of the sea, actually the rescue side that I recall you mentioning in there about obligations, that sounds very similar to what happens with those round the world yacht races where obligations are required to rescue people in distress.
It's very similar to the requirement if you're the first ship in proximity or the closest ship in proximity to go and rescue if someone's in distress in the high seas. Yeah, it's a very similar obligation.
In fact, I remember there was a problem recently where somebody was not doing that, and they criticised them. I'm trying to recall how many years back that was. But there's problems with people who don't do that too, and that's it certainly looks like it's required to do. And I think that's probably the closest analogy. In some ways, the law of the sea would be similar to what you could apply in space, I suppose, although the only bad thing I can think about is pirates. So,
yeah, we really don't want space pirates, although, you do have that in The Martian in the movie.
So that's probably you get the bad people over there as well for the same reason. Okay.
Yeah, well, Stacey can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think, in fact, the law of the sea alongside the Antarctic treaty were two of the foundational documents that the Outer Space Treaty was based on.
Absolutely.
In a sense, it's not the law of the sea that applies in space, but a derivation, which is where the rescue type stuff comes in. Yeah. That was inspired by the law of the sea.
It's also where we get the principle for the common heritage of humankind. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sort of foundational work.
Commons. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Can I ask you a question, Stacey? Have you looked at all as a bit of a comparison to your modern science fiction pieces to Alfred Bester's Tiger or The Star's My Destination?
Not yet. Not yet. So this is fairly new, a fairly new stream to my research. So it started modern because that was just what I was reading at the time. Although Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy is not that modern, but
no, it's not that new, but it's a lot newer than 1956.
Yeah, absolutely.
The reason I'm mentioning it is that it's a long time since I've read it, but it has an interesting situation where you have effectively a corporate feudalism that runs the solar system. So you have mega corporations where that literally behave like medieval families or clans, so that the head of the Kodak company is the Kodak of Kodak, and so on. Or the what was his name? Mr. Macy, who was the head of the Sears Roebuck Kimball clan, sort of bringing together big corporations moving out. And, there may be, obviously it's not exactly the same scenario. And of course it's based in a 50s approach to not just science fiction, but obviously to corporate, the corporate world. But you might find that interesting as a, not a counterbalance or a contrast, but a slightly different way of looking at the aspect of corporate control.
That's an excellent suggestion. Thank you. That's definitely something I'll add to my planned list of extra things I get to read.
Yeah. Okay. So Vicky's put something. I wonder whether there's any examples of this on Earth, such as Antarctica. Yeah. Well, actually, that's what Kerry was talking. There is actually a similarity, I think, with the way that the laws have been drafted. So I think that
similar origins.
Yeah, the origins, the definite analogies there as to where that's all come from in the first place, which is right. Looking at it, that's true.
Yeah, there's some interesting stuff too, and this is slightly off topic, Stacey, but if you want to comment about it, drawing from the Antarctic stations is the question of whose law applies. So in other words, when you've got a station that may have multinational people working there, the law of the parent country, for want of a better word, applies if there's any criminal acts committed. And my understanding is that for the International Space Station, the law of each country that owns the particular module applies. So of course, if you have lots of fun, if an American shoots a Russian in the Japanese module, you're gonna have a lot of fun.
You have lots of jurisdictional arguments about who has jurisdiction to prosecute. Absolutely. So that was something that was dealt with in the intergovernmental agreement, which was set up as part of managing the ISS.
Yes. Yeah.
So it was almost dealt with through contract law.
Yeah. The interesting thing is, again, I will admit I haven't read the Expanse series yet, although I have them sitting on the shelf right here beside me to be read. Does anybody deal with that aspect of whose law does apply in these multi-corporate or multinational situations?
Yeah, so pretty much when we get into the Expanse series, we're already in the situation where there's just control and it really comes down to these mega huge corporations with so much power to control even a war, like to start countries fighting against each other. So it's kind of gone too big already by the time we're introduced to corporations in the Expanse. Be really interesting to see if there's any historical science fiction that deals with before things are at the mega corporate phase. I have access to a collection of old science fiction through the library here at Flinders, which is a special science fiction collection that was donated by somebody. And
there's a really good one at Sydney Uni too.
It's great, isn't it, to have access to those resources?
The one at Sydney Uni, if you ever get the opportunity, that was originally the collection of Ron Graham, who was literally a member of First Fandom, and he had an amazing collection. He literally had a 2-story library built in the back of his home. He's quite a wealthy man. And he had this 2-story library where you had sort of every issue of sort of every science fiction magazine from the year dot, as well as an amazing collection of obviously books and things. So if you can't find it at Flinders, you may want to look at the resources there, because I have seen it I have seen that collection when Ron was still alive.
Yep.
And this is just an amazing resource, especially for the stories that are in the magazines.
That's brilliant. Excellent. Thank you. I didn't know about that Sydney collection. That's brilliant.
I'm not trying to do a Sydney versus Adelaide thing here.
I know.
I believe it's the biggest collection in Australia.
I'm now trying to work out when's the next time I'm going to be in Sydney so I can go and have a look at it.
Yeah, it's at the Fisher Library, Sydney Uni. It's one of the special collections.
Probably give them a call first. Actually, just thinking about what Alan's comment. Yeah, boy, our descendants are going to have to grapple with some issues. I think that probably the interesting statement made about what Elon Musk wanted to do. I'm surprised that he actually might be allowed to do what you're suggesting, Stacey, in terms of getting. I mean, obviously, it's signing a contract, but they might. If anybody wants to get legal advice about what their rights are, I would assuming that they would get that on Earth and then tell them, no, don't sign the contract.
And they'll sign it anyway, because how often do we sign terms and conditions without reading them?
I know that. And, we're dealing with a bunch of telcos at the moment, for example, who seem to think that we're, actually, the internet's very unregulated. I almost think that that's an area that could potentially be a good analogy to the way space is operating at the moment, because if you look at companies like Google, they do things which are not necessarily under government's regulation at the moment. They're doing stuff outside in fact, making their own rules up, and I don't know whether governments are controlling them properly.
That's a very, very good point, Wayne.
Well, they aren't controlling.
They pretty much do what they like.
Well, no, governments don't do anything to stop them either, for some strange.
No.
So quite frankly, we've got a problem now already. It's not a matter of space. It's a matter of, are we going to allow corporations that get too big try to do this type of thing anyway, because they think they're outside. They're not part of any particular country, I suppose, is the words I'm using. And that's the danger we've got.
Well, look at the tax issues alone.
Well, it's not the tax issues. The thing is, there's the initial, but it's not just the tax issues. You know that Google decides how often your digital certificate has to be renewed. They were the ones that changed the rules on the how frequently your SSL certificates need to be renewed on servers. They actually changed those rules and forced everybody to go to 12 months. Originally, it was longer than that. It was Google that forced everyone else to do it. So because they think they can run the internet, that's the problem. So that's the things you're dealing with at the moment. And I suppose we could have big space companies that could do the same thing. You just don't want it. Okay, so we got Julian. Okay, you want to throw AI into the mix? Oh, God, yes. AI, yes, AI would be... but it's a matter of what you want AI to be involved with, decisions to be made, I suppose. I think the AI's got to be sorted out in a sense in terms of what AI is going to be allowed to do, but whether we're going to be using it in space context it's going to be a normal problem for us anywhere with how AI is going to operate and what you can and you can't do with that. Anyway.
Can I ask a question around just Stacey? It'd be interesting to see what the studies that come out about the human the psychology studies, because
Sure.
I think we make the assumption that limited resources and people will be fighting with each other, and I wonder whether that's the case. When we see people in extreme situations, extreme and hostile environments, whether they pull together more or whether they're at each other's throats, like in a lot of sci-fi movies. I don't think it's necessarily the case. I think people do tend to pull together or, work together collaboratively when there's, sometimes. I think it depends on the circumstances, but if there's limited resources or the environment is hostile.
There's some great studies being done at the moment in sort of like remote working environments and like really extreme working environments. And Antarctica is an obvious example, but also, other sort of isolated, harsh working environments. And the psychological studies that are going to come out of there, I think, are going to be really useful for seeing, do the humans come together? Do they fracture? What are the conditions around each of those outcomes? And what can we put in place to maximize the positive outcome? And that's where I think the law is going to need to catch up. Once we know what those things are, how do we make those things happen? And I think we need to be really proactive. Law tends to be quite reactive. It waits for something really horrific to happen, and then we create law to stop it happening again, or to try to stop it happening again. So I think this is going to be a situation, just given the risks are just so, I suppose, amplified when we're thinking about space. I think the law is going to have to be a little bit more proactive once we have the data from all of those psychological studies.
Yeah.
If I could just make a comment, I think you've got two different sorts of circumstance where groups of people can be put under stress. If you're talking about something like the Antarctic or a very remote place, then yes, the people are under stress, but there is essentially a rescue mission. There's the next boat or there's the next supply truck coming in, and everyone knows that. So you pull together so that you can be in the best situation when the next ship or truck or whatever comes in to supply you, and you move on. If there's no truck or ship coming in, then that's a very different situation, and I think people will react very differently.
Fair point. I was actually thinking about the remoteness. You're talking about Antarctica. Actually, other places to come to would be places like the Pilbara, where they're doing mining and stuff like that, how people react in group situations there. That would be another type of thing because it's extremely hot and there's a limited number of people all working in this project or something like that. So that would be another thing they'd be doing it for.
Yeah, oil rigs are another one that they look at.
Oil rigs are that type of mining operation where how the interactions between the crew members. But I suppose, as Scott said, that could be seen differently too. I suppose if the people think that they're going to be regulated versus not regulated, like light at the end of the tunnel. With okay, Alan, you put some comment on the adversarial environment. Yeah, okay, well, that's even potentially going to happen on the moon, isn't it? You're thinking about it, because the Artemis Accord has got 32 signatories, and they're saying how people need to behave on the moon. But theoretically, if the Chinese got there, they're not subject to the Artemis Accord.
So they're not a signatory to it.
The Outer Space Treaty.
But they are a signatory to the Outer Space Treaty, are they?
Yes,
okay.
they are.
Okay. Right. So they'd have some control then. Yeah,
absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. And certainly the way that the Chinese space activities are happening and being carried out at the moment, there's no suggestion that they're breaching any of the international obligations that we know about.
No, I don't think that's the problem. It's more the exploitation, I think, is what's going to happen there, because I think even with the Artemis business, there's going to have to be some type of mining going on there to build the base. So I think that's going to be something that will happen, and then they'll be working out what else they can do on the moon if they find anything that's really super valuable.
Yeah. Depends if they get there first. I think that's what we're going to see. We're going to see whoever gets there first is going to set some of the boundaries around what the law is then going to be and how it's going to actually apply in real time with real mining activity. I mean, it's great that we've got these wonderful rules at the moment, but the wonderful thing about international law is it can evolve through practice and through how countries are implementing their obligations. So we're going to start to see some of that over the next decade or so.
Yeah, I think it's
interesting question. I think there's going to be how much or how the Chinese want to be perceived by the international community.
Yeah, well,
so are they going to want to take a moral high ground based on the Outer Space Treaty if they think, for example, that the US and the Artemis Accords countries might actually try to do things like mining that are not exactly in accord with the Outer Space Treaty? So I think that's something that
they might call them out, in other words, Gary, that's what you're thinking.
Yeah. So they, look, we're really better than them because we're abiding by the Outer Space Treaty and the other guys aren't.
Yeah.
Or vice versa, of course. The Americans could do the same if the
you're right, and they are virtually on adversarial terms at the moment, despite what's happening. They're certainly not a signatory. There's now 32 countries, I believe, have signed the Artemis Accord, which means that they're all subject to the same set of rules, obviously, and they might seek to, those 32 countries, help work with the US to set up some type of base there. So that's what all those parties are hoping for, having been a signatory. That's what that means.
Yeah, it means you get to play, basically. You get to play as part of Artemis.
Well, that's a big deal.
Which is why we signed up.
Yep.
Right. And I believe that Argentina signed recently, for example. So there's a lot of countries involved with it. Trying to remember whether India is actually a signatory. That would be another play that would be certainly fairly important, but I didn't think they were a signatory yet. I'll have to go and look at the names. I'll have to go and look at the 32 names.
Check the flags.
Yes.
Well, it's getting bigger now. I know that there's a lot of countries involved in it.
Actually, I know they might have done, because after all, India has ambitions for going to the moon.
Well, that would be one of the other major players as well, because certainly they've got, if they had the will to do it, that's the main discussion at the moment. Although I've got something talking about their manned spacecraft later on. There's a bit of coverage on that I'll touch on later on, but it looks like they are obviously.
I saw something not so long ago that they were actually talking about certainly getting humans onto the moon.
Well, they're certainly trying to get the space capsule up, but what it does mean is that it really does depend on their budget and how much they want to devote to it. They've got a lot of other problems India has, apart from, getting humans up into space and, dealing with their own problems in India itself. And the government's priorities don't appear to be just throwing a large amount of money at things like the Chinese probably are for different reasons because of the prestige side. That's the China, and it's also partly military as well. Their objectives, that over in China, it blurs between the two, doesn't it? Really, so as to what they're doing and why they're doing it, I think. So that's the thing to note.
Don't underestimate India looking at space activities as a prestige thing as well.
Oh, no.
When it comes to the astronauts.
I'm not disputing that. It's just that they aren't really spending the money, but not that they haven't got the technical ability. I think that's no doubt they do, but it's just how they've got the will to do it. What's the difference between an accord and a treaty? Well, that's a good question, actually. Can we
answer that very quickly? So the Artemis Accords are a political commitment, not binding law, and a treaty is binding law. So a treaty is piece of international law that you sign up to as a country and you agree to be bound by. In addition, in international law, we also have customary international law, which is formed through countries behaving in a particular way with a sense of an obligation to act in that particular way. So some parts of our outer space treaty have crystallized into customary international law, which means they apply to everybody, whether they've signed the treaty or not.
Yeah, okay.
Which is actually quite an important point because that often doesn't get discussed in discussions of how the Outer Space Treaty applies.
There's certain parts of it that are absolutely customary international law and have been for around 50 years. So trying to get out of those obligations is going to be far more problematic.
Maybe that's the way to hold the corporates to more account.
That's my hope.
Well, that's what I was thinking too, basically, because it's like what you said earlier. It's somebody asking you to sign a contract to, if you haven't got the money for something to do, you have to be an indentured serf.
Yeah, sign your life away.
It terrifies me.
It's terrifying.
Yeah, absolutely.
But then again, Mr. Musk does do some strange things sometimes, so that might have been one of his thought bubble ideas But no, I hadn't heard of that.
How about a couple of times so far, and also in his Starlink terms of service, he has a condition that says that Mars is going to make its own law later on, and all that kind of thing. You can't contract out of international law like that. So it's come up a few times.
There's the clause that people don't notice in the bottom of their Starlink contract that says, "We own your firstborn and your soul."
It's the small print, I suppose, is always the problem. But yeah, it does. But hopefully he has some his CEOs can control him because, as I said recently, the two CEOs that are managing his other companies both happen to be women, and they're managing him quite well at the moment. So that's the hope we've got. So yes, okay. Just looking at some news a few months ago, USA not recognising spaces in commons. Oh, that's such significance. Okay, so where did you hear that, Julian? He does that. In other words, the USA.
It comes out a lot. So the US has a particular take on what the international obligations are in the Outer Space Treaty and what the common heritage of humankind means. So common heritage of humankind is the term that's used in the Outer Space Treaty. The US says that is not the same thing as a global commons. So the normal rules that apply to a global commons don't apply to space because it's the common heritage of humankind, not a global commons. So again, it's that kind of
weasel wording.
Specific word.
It is semantics though there, and it's almost like that's part of the reason why they refused to sign, be signatory in the other contract because of. But it is coming back down to exploitation, I suspect, to some degree. That's part of the reason why.
That one comes down particularly to the wanting to go and do the mining activities and the pressure from corporates to allow that. Yeah.
It'll be interesting to see whether we can ever change their mind on it, but it sounds like that's not going to happen. But anyway, we can at least try to manage them, I suppose, is the only words I can use.
So, Anne, does this mean you're cool with going to Mars under Elon Musk's terms?
I'm not necessarily saying that I would do that, but I can see that there would be a lot of people who would see, because I know that I have relatives who that's how they got to the United
How
States,
they came to the US, yeah.
Servants, okay. Right.
including on the Mayflower.
Oh, so they did have, I suppose.
Oh, yes.
The servants, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I guess it's one of those things. Indentured servitude is all right if you've got a good master.
Or if you are the master.
Slavery
Or if you are the master, yes.
Are the master, yeah.
Yeah, it was abolished about 200 years ago, wasn't it? That's true, but okay. Yes.
Well, unless you're a soccer player, aren't they indentured servants who get very well paid? Come on, if you're a Premier League soccer player, you get traded between countries and teams with almost no say-so yourself, even though you get paid really well.
The only problem is that those guys are getting paid so much money, they probably, for what they could do, they
can enjoy their gilded cages.
Buy their own plane and buy their own sports cars and things like that. And they can complain as much as they like, but I think they've got a lot more goods than what we have, unfortunately. And we still wonder why, is probably a lot of people would say.
Oh, yes, why did they get paid so much? But anyway.
Yeah, it's a little bit envious, but it's a bit sad though as well. Okay.
But you just have to remember that if it's somebody's dream to go to Mars, that they might be willing to sign, 5 years of 5 years of my life.
Well, I suppose that's true. And then how can you be exploited? I suppose what it does mean is, though, we do have to be a little bit careful about the whole business, and that's to a degree. We have to then look at.
Yeah, it's also an interesting question, because let's say this indentured servitude type thing was to go ahead. Obviously, it would still restrict the kind of people who could go to Mars under that system.
Yes,
because if you're somebody like me over 60, I might want to sell my soul to go to Mars, but they probably wouldn't take me because they would not
see your potential.
They would not get their money's worth out of me.
Bad risk, and that's unfortunately another problem with how they decide who's in and who's out. The assessment process could be a bit unfair too. That's the other issue. That's right. They would tend to like the gullible people then, rather than the ones who think.
But indentured servants weren't necessarily gullible. That was just a way to pay your.
No, that's right. It was just a way to pay.
And they often became very, just like, even though it wasn't really indentured servants here, they the settlers that came here with very little, or got land grants or whatever, those are all kind of similar. And because there was a real problem a few years ago where a lot of people were saying, equating indentured servants to slaves, and there's no comparison.
No, they're different situations. That's quite true.
I mean, it's possible though in an enclosed environment like Mars, an indentured servant could become a slave because you wouldn't have.
Well, that's right. The possibility of exploitation.
Like the company store in mining towns, where
prices get jacked up and all the rest of it, so that I kind of see it actually potentially being more like the people in places like India and Bangladesh and that, who work in the garment factories, and they're more or less almost prisoners in the garment factories, especially if they're workers from another country. And then they're, look at all those people that went to Qatar and places like that to build the facilities for the World Cup, and they were slaves in all but name, apparently.
What was the reason, Stacey, for Saudi Arabia pulling out of that treaty, by the way?
So this is an interesting one. Saudi Arabia was a party to the Moon Agreement, then signed up to Artemis, and then withdrew from the Moon Agreement. So everyone got all very excited that there was a link between the Moon Agreement and them deciding to join Artemis. There was some reason that you couldn't be a party to both, which Australia is. So everyone was sort of thinking, well, does that mean Australia is going to have to withdraw from the Moon Agreement? The rumors that we have is that this was a trade-off, that Saudi Arabia has withdrawn to give more like political strength to the Artemis Accords by the balancing of the numbers. So the Moon Agreement numbers have gone down and the Artemis Accords numbers go up.
Okay,
Or
right.
it was like a favor deal to the US.
Yeah, wouldn't surprise me either.
But they've also got a lot of human rights issues, of course. So that's why.
Oh, yes.
I said that's why it wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, so it makes me wonder what's going on there with that.
I'll bet you that's the reason. What Stacey said.
Oh, that's probably right. Thinking about it, and they are always trying to curry favour with certain parties, and that would be one way of doing it. But morality is always under question. So as to why they do things, their motives, I suppose that's thinking about it. That would be good reason for it. Okay. Probably don't want to keep Stacey too much longer, but I'd say it's been a really stimulating talk. That was what I was hoping when we did this. A few people talking about different things, and it's one thing that we don't always really look at, but we do need to think about it. I think in terms of what you want as an outcome for space exploration, anyway. Yeah. So I think I really would appreciate your time tonight, Stacey, to do that, because you allowed a few people to understand a bit more about how the legal side's working and think about. I mean, science fiction is a good analogy too, actually, because a lot of people might aspire to what happens in science fiction and wish the world's like it, but then you've got to look also that sometimes can be used to show people things that aren't always right either, and then try to work out how we can fix it, so to speak, and not make the same mistakes. And it's a good way of looking at it too, in terms of doing it. So I really appreciate your time tonight and talking to us about it.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for the discussion. It's been a great way to spend a Monday evening.
Well, that's all right. Anyway, I appreciate that. And what we will be doing anyway, I'll usually edit before and after, and I'll give you the links later on when it's up on the website, Stacey, because we've got actually a whole bunch of talks going back 3 years. So you'll be one of about 30, but I mean, we usually have a fairly diverse group, so you might find something else you're interested there anyway.
That's great. Thank you.
I had a couple of things, presentations from the Lockett Lab, for example, that have been quite good too, and talking about what they're up to. So we've got a few things on there you might be interested in anyway, just generally. So I'll have to go and get our friends over in South Australian Launch Company to try and get them to talk to us. Maybe I'll try and let Lloyd Damp and find if we can find out what they're up to. That'll be another